Well, many people and organizations have a dependency or a reliability through hardware, through software, components, right, to do the nature of the business or to do the job functions, right? We've got laptops or mobile phones, there may be software dependencies on them that we have to have the sales portal page or a marketing landing page, and we become dependent on third party components at times, right? So, what happens when we break or a vendor no longer supports that specific software or appliance we use, or they go out of business, or it's end of life and we can no longer support it and there's data on there? Well, we've got to make sure that we manage our dependencies and our considerations adequately throughout our business nature. And typically, when we talk about third party risk management and the considerations across dependencies, there are a few third party software dependencies, and I'll just put in software dependencies that we need to be aware of as we go through this life cycle, right? So the very first part is, I use specific tools as well, right? So when I'm writing these videos out, I've got a whiteboard here that I use, the whiteboard component. I use a certain programming tool to obviously record the videos. From a technical landscape as well, I use obviously certain tool sets to perform my job function and my job duties. So what happens when I have problems with event, like with a software, right? Or specific program that I'm using? Well, hopefully we have some sort of maintenance contract, and typically businesses will have a maintenance contract. Either they're using a printing supplier and that printer no longer works, well then our contract with that printing manufacturer or that provider says, well, we can get in touch with that vendor and ask them for support, right? We can call them, we can email them, maybe we have our own process, right? So we can ask for help, and going through our maintenance contracts in that case is one of those areas, either through software as well as hardware. But while we're on that subject of software, there's a maintenance contract where we can reach out and obviously ensure that there's a service level agreement that doesn't disrupt our business, and we can get things back up and running in obviously a very time sufficient manner. So that's one area, and obviously keeping up to date with these bug fixes and ensuring versions coming out where we're supporting them. Um, but obviously, we understand if they're about to become end of life as well. So then we can have some sort of process in place that if that software becomes out of life or it's no longer supported by that vendor, well, then we need to do our due diligence, right? So we need to be proactive and ensure that if that does happen, well, we can then obviously switch over to a new platform or a new provider, and obviously, support our business through that requirement of the dependency on that specific software. So again, we need to know that obviously if that vendor as well goes out of business, well, what do we do, right? So we need to be aware of things. We need to obviously be aware that we're dependent on a specific vendor. So I'm just going to put here that, be aware that we're obviously utilizing a specific vendor, and then have a plan B. At times we're going to have some sort of plan that allows us to manage our environment adequately. And sometimes things happen unprecedentedly through our environment, and we need to be aware of that. So have a backup plan. Ensure that we're aware of our infrastructure. We go through our asset inventory. We understand what we're using. We understand why we're using it. There's a description. There's ownership there. And if anything happens in this case with software, well, then we can switch over to maybe a new platform or a new provider to support us in that process. So again, if that software vendor becomes out of date, so maybe the software flavor itself becomes end of life, well, there's a few things here that we can do as well, right? So obviously we've got downtime. There could be money involved. Obviously, we have to go there and maybe buy new appliances and stuff like that. So the real thing here is obviously ensuring that we're planning ahead. So I'm just going to put a big plan ahead. And that's vital because we need to ensure that we're planning ahead. We're always staying ahead of that curve and ensuring our inventory and hardware and software is all up to date. We're doing business correctly, and obviously aware of that risk. That obviously that risk that we're aware of, and obviously planning against it as well. So, kind of being aware of that. And then we've got hardware. So we've spoken about software. Let's talk a bit about hardware as well. There's hardware dependencies, right? So what happens when hardware fails if we're using a specific routing appliance or an IPS appliance and it's a physical component, or a hardware server that we've got in place, or the power supply fails, or something goes and doesn't boot up correctly, right? And just maybe doesn't boot up at all. And there is a hardware fault, and these things do happen. Sometimes you just come in and that server is just blinking and it's doing nothing, and you're going, well, what has happened? And now you've got to go away and investigate, and you're kind of being reactive to that nature. We really need to be proactive in that sense. So again, kind of going through that maintenance agreement, and ensuring that we've got a hardware maintenance agreement, maybe with that firewall vendor. Hopefully, there's a 24/7, 24/7 contract available to us that if they can get us out something to replace that infrastructure. Hopefully, we've got a backup of the running configurations as well, so we're doing proper backups and things like that. And then we can switch over and replace either if it's hardware or if it's physical fault of an appliance of some sort. But we're going to have to review our maintenance agreement, right? Ensure that there is a service level agreement there with a third, obviously that third party provider that we're using. Then we've got things maybe like a cold standby. Is there something that we can momentarily plug in, or maybe an older flavor of that router, an old flavor of that server that we can just plug in? Maybe it's a spare piece of hardware, and then we can just swap that out and reduce our downtime. So that could be something that could be much more favorable as well. So we could have a cold standby available or as a solution to us. Well, what happens if the, the business goes out of business, right? If we're dealing with a specific vendor and they just don't operate anymore, or they've changed ownership and now there's a new management team that's come in and there's all these new changes to their environment. Well, plan B. We need to prepare for that, and we need to be up to date that maybe the provider that we're using is maybe declining in the revenues, and they may be one day out of business, right? So we have to be up to date with that. Be aware of our environment is the most important thing, and ensuring that we're keeping up to date with things that are obviously changing and things that could potentially become legacy or end of life that are no longer going to support us, and what's the impact going to be to our business if that does occur. So have a plan B ready, make sure that you're dealing with the right people to support you through that process, and obviously that helps us then as we talk about managing risk, right? It's all about risk management and reducing that risk. So, what are two things that we can do to basically manage our risk, right? So, first thing that we need to do is, well, once we've identified what that risk is, so we need to identify the risk, which is the first thing. And obviously, what are our hardware? What are our software dependencies? What do they look like? What do they look like? Are they documented? Do we know what platforms we're using first and foremost? Um, so we need to go away and obviously identify that risk. And what does that look like? What are the risks associated with that? And then we go away and build out a control plan. And typically with our control plan basically helps us control the outcomes in the case of a hardware failure or a software failure. We've got basically a plan there that helps us manage and obviously hopefully mitigate that risk, but it's a process that allows us to plan, right? So what can the planning look like? So what is this control plan? What does this thing look like? Well, typically it's kind of like a maintenance kit plan, or maybe it's a 3 hour service level agreement within 24 hours, or due to the risk of the business downtime, there could be multiple ways of things that could contribute to the plan. There could be things like that we do maybe a 12-month audit. Every 12 months, someone in the business comes in and audits our hardware dependencies, our software dependencies. And that way we can do this because things change in the environment. Maybe we're doing an audit to ensure things are up to date and current. We're staying ahead and we don't forget about something that we may have overlooked, and then it becomes a chaotic environment. So doing those 12-month contract or the 12-month audits of our infrastructure, or maybe 6 monthly if you're in a high sort of high paced environment, we'll do that 6 months. We'll do it 12 months. There's no real silver bullet here, right? It's just what works for you, and obviously the appetite that you have as well through to support you through your resources, through your job functions. So, and I know sometimes that's quite challenging. So, other times it could be those things like the maintenance plan, right? Ensuring we've got a maintenance plan with our third party vendor. There's maybe an SLA in place or an organizational level agreement, an OLA, and we're adhering to that. We look at these things and ensure that if something does occur, then how quick can we get things back up and running? So that's kind of it when we talk about our considerations and our dependencies around using obviously our third party risk management. I hope you found this video useful. And as always, thank you for viewing, and see you all in the next video. Bye for now.